Here we go. All right. Um, Again, yes, I'm Deborah Mattson. I'm head of the printmaking department at the KIA. Um, there are two things I'd like you to learn about today. One is just a little bit about the history of printmaking and understanding what printmaking is and some of the different types of printmaking there are. But I want you to learn about that in the context of how printmakers and printmaking have addressed pandemics in the past. Um, I think that that's one of the gifts that art has for us, is that we can understand how people in different generations before us have interpreted and experienced events that are very much like things that we go through. This first image I'm showing you, it's basically not so much about pandemic, but about, I want you to understand how important printmaking was when it first was invented and started to be spreading throughout the world. What you're looking at here are two of the earliest printed books. The one on top, let's see if I can get my cursor going. Oh, here we go. The one on top is the Diamond Sutra. It's a woodcut scroll dating from about 868, the Common Era. This is the earliest dated book we have. It's a Buddhist text. Below it, we have an image of the Gutenberg Bible. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Gutenberg Bible was printed around 1455 by Johannes Gutenberg, who in the Western world invented the printing press around 1451. It was the first book printed with metal type, which had actually been invented in Korea earlier, but through trade, Asian inventions like paper and movable type made their way to Europe. And there, all these concepts were kind of assembled in the mind and workshop of Johannes Gutenberg. And this Bible was one of the first things he printed. In showing these two images to you, what I want you to understand is how important printmaking was for the democratization of information. It really was something on the level of the internet was in our culture about 20, 30 years ago. All of a sudden, all sorts of information and all sorts of images could be spread throughout the known world. Wherever people could carry paper, they could carry information, they could carry texts. And this is not something that people had before. Before, information was either oral or it was written down by hand, single copies, paintings and sculpture, works of art that were owned by the wealthy and the powerful. So this has always been part of the heritage of printmaking, is to share images, to share information. The Diamond Sutra has in its text, this book is for universal free distribution. This was the concept. This has always been, not totally, because of course, many, if not most, prints are sold, but just the concept of being able to share, for everyone to see something, for everyone to learn something. So moving on from this, in this image, at first I want to talk about this German word in the upper right, Bildwissenschaft. This refers to the awareness and study of all images, not just fine art images. And it factors a lot into printmaking, because as this new technology came about, it was used for a lot more than just making fine art prints, which is very much what a lot of printmaking is today. So throughout this presentation, and I think whenever you look at images, remember that when we study images and art images, it's more about just fine art, but everything that is printed and manufactured and that is a part of our visual world. This tends to be more of a German concept, but it's also known among art history scholars in the United States as well, but it pertains very much to printmaking, because so much of what printmaking has been throughout the centuries is, again, disseminating information, whether it looks beautiful or not. So the image you have here, you see Jesus Christ being crucified on a tau cross. This type of publication or print was called a pest build. Pest being plague, build being a drawing. These were printed during the plague, and people would use these pest builds. They might put them up in their house or carry them in their pockets, and they were almost like an amulet of protection against the plague. And we see here one of the many uses of printed paper, ephemera. Once people have it in their hand, it gives them a sense of power and of knowing. And I think what's kind of remarkable about this particular pest build, you can look at it and meditate on the suffering of Christ, as maybe a lot of medieval early Renaissance people might do, and when they're praying and hoping that the plague will not affect their life. But there's that on the bottom, there's that nail or spike, and it's labeled that this is the exact size of the spike that was used to crucify Jesus Christ. Now, whether it was or not, we don't know, but this gives you an idea of the concept. As you know, as printmaking became extant, also this sharing of knowledge, it's kind of the beginning of people saying things, whether they were true or not, but if it was printed on a piece of paper, it really gave it some authority. And again, people could look at this and they could feel like they really knew what this was all about. And it kind of, whenever we have information, it gives us a sense of power, a sense of security that we know something. And it was this sense of security and knowing that really became widespread once printmaking really took a toehold in Europe and the Western world. So here we have a very simple print. This is a woodcut. It's very primitive. But what I want to mention here is that printmaking itself as a technology started in Europe almost exactly the same time as the Great Plague did, the bubonic plagues. So we're talking the first Black plagues, they started like the mid 1300s, late 1300s. Throughout the 1400s, these plagues are constantly cropping up through Europe. The Great Plagues at their end, they claimed about as many as 2 million lives. It took about a third of the European population. And here you see this kind of primitive illustration. And this is actually a print shop. You see at the left, someone setting type, people at the press, someone looking at a book, maybe they want to buy over at the right. And all of them are being grabbed by these skeletons of death. And it was just something that was on the mind of people at the time. No matter who you were, no matter what you were doing, the plague, death could come and grab you and haul you away. I'm going to be talking a little later about Albrecht Dürer. He wrote in his journal, anyone who's among us today could be buried tomorrow. And this is just the sense that people had at this time of the Great Plagues. And it was into this world that printmaking was born. Western printmaking came about. So there was all sorts of opportunities to illustrate, to print the pest builds, to warn people, whatever information, true or not, people could print, they would. And this, again, it just goes to show just kind of this explosion of knowledge. So around the same time, this is a woodcut called The Dance of Death. You can see from the label there, it's a leaf from the Nuremberg Chronicle, which was published in 1493. The Nuremberg Chronicle is very important in printmaking. It was a book in which the authors who lived in Nuremberg, Germany, which was a big trade, a huge trade city, a lot of information, goods, knowledge passing through. And the Nuremberg Chronicle, they were trying to print all the information known to man at the time. It was just kind of like an encyclopedia of everything people, the publishers felt they knew and that people should know. You may recognize that the dance of death motif was very common in the Middle Ages. You see it even today in celebrations around Halloween and Day of the Dead. It's this concept that it's about the universality of death. It's something that everyone goes through. kind of a stoic attitude that there's nothing you can do about it. Here you see these skeletons. They're almost kind of gleeful. There's one's playing a musical instrument here. They're literally dancing like it's a party. And then here below, they're kind of removing the shroud from this half decomposed person who's going to, basically join the party, as it were. And when we look at these dance of death motifs, they are very much about the Middle Ages and the fact that the plague was everywhere. But there's kind of a difference too between images that are about just the fact that everyone dies, so you may as well accept it, and a different kind of fear that gripped people when these plagues would come through society. And not just, your run-of-the-mill illnesses, accidents, and old age were killing people, but a wide and quickly spreading disease that just took people away overnight. So you will see a lot of these dance of death images. They're not necessarily about the plague, however. But this is definitely a plague image. This is a woodcut. It's called The Demon of the Plague. And it was from a book it was like a field book of disease and suffering. Here, there are no skeletons dancing. You see a man suffering. He's covered with the bew balls or sores of the plague. The woman is begging for mercy. And in the sky above, you see this demon who's kind of flagellating this person. And this is more of a frightening and horrific scene. It's also getting to a little bit more of a sophisticated type of woodcut. And I want to talk here a little bit about what a woodcut is. It's a type of relief printing. The earliest printing that we know of, including type and movable type, was relief printing. And what that means is that you have a raised surface, you apply ink to that surface, and then when you put your paper or cloth against it and lift it up, anything that is covered with ink will then be transferred in reverse to your paper or cloth. So when you think about that and you think that these are woodcuts, the dark lines and dark areas you see are raised wood. And that means all the white areas have been carved away. And this is something always to remember and appreciate when you're looking at woodcuts or any type of relief printmaking, is that the artist or craft person, it's not as when we draw and we pick up a pen or pencil and what we draw is kind of like that positive image. We're laying it down. What the printmaker has to think about is a negative image, and then he or she has to take away everything that they don't want to print and just leave behind on the wood what they do want to print. So for example, all the halos around the man's head, all the white areas have been carved out of a block of wood, and things like the rays and all the other details and cross hatchings have been left behind. So every white area is something that has been carved away from the wood, and then the block of wood left behind is inked up and used to make impressions. It's also important to remember with printmaking, just so you appreciate, in printmaking, everything is always done in reverse, because when you take that impression, it's like you're flipping the paper over and seeing the image that you really want to see. And all of the printmaking that we'll be looking at, that's true of except for silkscreen printing, which we'll be coming into later in the 20th century. So here, this is truly a woodcut about the miseries of the bubonic plague and how people felt about it, how they were just being attacked by some demon. Remember, these people didn't have our modern medical knowledge, and it was all the more frightening that they didn't always even know where this was coming from. Again, this is another woodcut called Plague in the House by Hans Weiditz. It's around the 16th century, so 1500s. Again, this is not a happy dance of death scene. This is someone who's dying, his wounds are leaking. The people in the household are holding handkerchiefs up to their nose, and just a dead person, dead animals. It's like everything in the household is slowly dying, and we really kind of see the horror of what's happening. There's nothing humorous or comical about this in any way. it's more just a depiction of the horror of everything being wiped out. When you look at these woodcuts, you'll see that there are large areas of white, a lot of cross hatching and detail, but they're still a little bit simplistic compared to the artist I want to talk about next. And that is Albrecht Dürer, who really is considered the first really great printmaker in terms of taking printmaking from merely disseminating knowledge and printing it up and turning it into an art form. You can see by the dates that Dürer lived during the plague years. He was, some people consider Dürer the Leonardo of the North. He was born in the city of Nuremberg. We think he was one of the apprentices who worked on the Nuremberg Chronicle. And he was not just a great artist, but he did, for example, he's the first artist who did self-portraits through his life, like this one here. This is a self-portrait. I think he started in his teen years, and through his old age, you can see that he did not, he died in his late 50s, I believe. But we know what he looked like through his life. He kept journals, he wrote letters, he kept notes. He studied art, but also science and nature and philosophy. You may have seen some of his artwork that's extremely realist. His drawings of, for example, the hair, the clod of earth with the columbines growing from it, just so many works that were very realistic and informed by science. And he also was someone who his lifetime was very well acquainted with death, whether through the plague or not. He was the third of 18 children. His mother only lived, well, of those 18 children, only 3 reached adulthood. So that gives you some idea of how extant death was and how it was an everyday part of life. It was a part of birth and growing up in childhood if you made it through. And then on top of that comes the Black Plague. Again, it was Albrecht Dürer said, anyone who's among us today may be buried tomorrow. One of Dürer's firsts was that he published what we've considered the first printed artist book. It was the book, The Apocalypse. It's based on the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, which describes the end of time. It's very allegorical. There are just amazing scenes of horrific destruction, fear, creatures that can only be imagined because they don't exist among us. When Dürer was drawing these pictures, he took all his knowledge of science and the way things looked in his world and kind of cobbled together new and frightening creatures. And you can see that throughout the prints. I'm going to be sharing 3 of the prints with you today. No, I'm sorry. I just have 2 here. But the first one, and this is probably the most famous, is the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And the first thing you can see from a print like this, again, this is a woodcut. So everything white has been carved away. Every black line is a strip of wood that's been left behind, whether it's straight or curved. It really demonstrates the artistry of Dürer, and also those in his workshop, because, you know, he certainly did have helpers. One of the things that's very similar to some of the other Dance of Death type Middle Age and early Renaissance scenes is, if you look below, everyone's being trampled by these apocalyptic horsemen. The Pope is being trampled, and the peasants and the wealthy, male and female. It's just everyone's being leveled, very much what the plague did. I want to point out here these 4 horsemen left to right. First, we see the emaciated horse and rider is Death, with his winnowing fork, again, a biblical reference to the dead being winnowed or separated. Next, we see Famine carrying scales. Again, very common biblical reference. Scales are used to denote the marketplace, buying and selling of food. So Famine carries the empty scales. There is no food to be weighed. Next to that, you see a horseman with a sword, which is war. And then farthest to the right, we see pestilence. Pestilence has a bow and arrow, and I'm going to talk some more about the significance of that being used as a symbol of plague and illness. But in these apocalyptic biblical scenes, which Durer would have been very much aware of, and people of the time would have been aware of, whether or not they could actually read the Bible, they would, hear the stories in church. He's portraying these four horsemen, and as you can see, your eyes can just follow these diagonals from the left and the swirls of the clouds, this mayhem below, and then this diagonal of these four horsemen bringing their death and destruction and the wrath of God. You have an angel up there leading them on. And I think one of the things that we all know about plague or pestilence is it very often is accompanied with these other three horrors. Well, certainly death, but as I show you more prints, you'll kind of see a theme as when disease comes, it often comes with war and it comes with famine. And then there's the dying. It's kind of hard to separate these things out sometimes. I know in our times with COVID-19, we're not necessarily also at war, but we do experience the economic uncertainty that might be related with famine. There's certainly been death and just that general civil unrest that's coming. So I think even though this is a biblical reference from the mid 1400s, I think we can relate to it today. This is another woodcut. Again, you can really appreciate the artist and skill of Durer when you just look at the detail on this and realize it wasn't drawn with a pencil or pen and ink. It was carved out of wood. This is a reference to the part of Revelation which refers to the trumpets that the angels in heaven blow to announce various apocalyptic events that are going to happen. And this is, I believe it's the sixth trumpet is plague, when such a large percentage of people on the earth die. And here you can see the trumpet being blown, and you can see these angels with their swords, again, just kind of slashing down the general population. In the background, you see the horsemen still, and all these other strange beasts, which are in the apocalyptic visions. This is another famous Durer work, and it's not a part of the Apocalypse, but it is an engraving called Night, Death, and the Devil. And again, it comes from that plague era, kind of an illustration of how, this night, or even how we can go through our life very boldly, determined to be protected, to do things right. Here we see the faithful dog trotting along at the horse's heels, but then surrounded again, there's the pale horse and the rider Death with that hourglass, reminding the night that his hour can come at any time. There's that hideous demon above the horse's flanks, and the skull in the lower left that the horse is coming up to. Again, we admire the strength and the boldness of the horse and the knight, but we also see it's totally surrounded by all this grim detail of death that eventually will overtake everyone. And again, too, you can admire Durer's artistry. This gives you a good example if you look at like the tree formations above and below. He really did study nature and incorporate these things into his prints. And in all of Durer's work, there's just kind of that composition of so much detail and busyness that you can appreciate here. This is not a wood carving, this is an engraving. Engraving is a different type of printmaking, and it is not relief. It's a type of printmaking we refer to as intaglio. With intaglio prints, you're not printing off of a surface that's raised. You are putting ink into incisions that have been made into a plate, usually metal. And then when you run a piece of paper on that inked plate through a press, first of all, you'll apply ink to the entire plate, and then you'll polish it off so only ink remains in the incised lines. And then when you run that through a press, and lift your paper, all that ink that was in the lines that were incised will remain on the paper. So what this allows you to do is to get a little more detail, because it is a little bit more like drawing rather than carving away. So Dürer has, because this is an engraving, it means that he has used tools to carve these lines into metal. But he's going to print off the direct line, not what is what is relief, what is left over from his carving. And as we get as we move into newer centuries, we'll see that more and more of printmaking will be using this intaglio technique.
Hey, Deb.
Yes.
I've had a question.
Mhm.
Do you know about the approximate size of these pieces you're sharing with us?
That's a good question. I would guess, I should have labeled them, but I'm thinking most engravings and woodcuts are like less than a foot square, and sometimes matters of inches, like maybe 5 inches by 6 inches. Maybe
I've
like
seen
7
this
by
one in
10.
person. Night, Death, and the Devil. I've seen this one in person, and I think it was like no more than 5 by 8.
Yes, they're on pieces of paper. And when you consider that people are working with pieces of wood and metal, as you look at these prints, consider they're not like paintings, which can be like 2 feet by 3 feet or bigger. You know, we're not talking about a scale of feet. We're talking about a scale of inches. Remember, these things had to be put on a press bed and printed on pieces of paper. So yes, they are all smaller works on paper. Thanks for bringing that up, so people have an idea of the size, the different sizes of these.
Yeah, thank you.
This is the last set of Dürer prints I'm going to show. And what I think is interesting here at the bottom, you see it says first state and second state. This is a very common terminology in printmaking, because as you're working on a plate, very often you'll work on it, you'll take a print to see what you've got, then you can work on it some more. This is considered one of the advantages of printmaking, is that at any point when you're working on your matrix or whatever you're carving or drawing on to be printed, you can stop, you can print a bunch, and then if you want to make changes, you can keep going. When you're working with metal, you can even burnish things out and go back. But what you see here in the first state and versus the second state, which is extremely common, is basically there's just been a darkening of everything. Like up here, you see an arrow that's basically 2 lines with a quill, and Dürer's gone back and added some more lines to darken this up. Very often, especially if you had a magnifying glass, you could go through the whole print and kind of just see maybe a few more lines added, or maybe the lines have been made thicker so that they hold more ink, and that makes them darker. But again, this is an engraving of Saint Sebastian, shot full of arrows. And Saint Sebastian is a really important image in plague imagery. And I'm going to talk about that in my next slide. But this is Dürer's engraving of Saint Sebastian. Now I want to talk about Saint Sebastian and also about Saint Roch, because these are considered, if you will, the patron saints of the plague. Saint Sebastian on the left, you'll see him in art a lot, shot full of arrows. And I'm realizing now that maybe one of the reasons why this imagery is so popular is because it was used, again, like a pest build. People would have a picture of Saint Sebastian and they could pray in front of it and meditate on it. The story of Saint Sebastian is he was a saint during the time of Emperor Diocletian. For his faith, he was going to be executed by being shot full of arrows, but he didn't die. So unfortunately, he was clubbed to death. But because he was able to survive that onslaught of arrows, that was considered miraculous. And if you think back to the horsemen of the apocalypse who represented the plague, and he also had the bow and arrow. I think that one of the reasons why this imagery of the arrow was so popular to illustrate the plague is I this kind of came upon me. I was with my son watching one of these film, you know, it could have been Game of Thrones, I don't know. But if you look at medieval battle scenes in film, you'll often see that you'll just have a host, you'll just have a battalion of archers. And it's not like they stand there and aim at anything. They just all release arrows into the sky all at once, and they just fall where they will. And there's that randomness is kind of the horror of it, is that if you're in a battle, you can't be looking up into the sky, dodging arrows. You just have to go forward and hope one doesn't land on you. And I think that is why it's such a good image of the way the plague was seen. It was just something, it was like it fell out of the sky. You were going about your business, maybe even trying to be careful, but because again, people didn't understand medicine the way we do now, it was like it struck at random. It was just like something falling out of the sky, like an arrow just landing on you and killing you. And I think that's why you see so much of this arrow imagery when depicting the plague and illness. So we have Sebastian on the left, a very famous martyr, considered a patron saint of plague sufferers. And on the right, we have another saint. This is Saint Roque. And again, another pious early Christian who was afflicted with the plague, the bubonic plague. And in his suffering, he just reached out to others and tried to help them. And then it was, he had a gift of miraculous healing of himself and others. But usually in this, to the left is a wood engraving. Again, the Saint Sebastian is by Hans Baldering Green, late 1400s, early 1500s. A totally different style. This is on the left, a German woodcut, on the right, an Italian woodcut after a painting by Titian. And apparently they wanted to raise money for a school to Saint Roque in his honor and memory. And another good reason for printmaking. You can only sell one painting, but you can make prints and sell a lot of them. And they did this to make money to fund the school. And so around the border, you see these little scenes in the life of Saint Roque. And in the center, there he is. This is how he, as an icon, is usually portrayed. He's lifting up his robe to show that he has some sores on his leg. And part of his story is that in his illness, a dog brought him food, as you see in the lower left corner. So if you're looking at art and you see this figure lifting up his robe and there's sores on his leg and there's a dog next to him, especially a dog carrying bread in its mouth, that's Saint Roque. Also used as a patron saint that you would venerate, meditate on, in the hopes that you might prevent getting the plague or the illness yourself. Saint Roque is also the patron saint of dogs, because he was helped and so loyally followed and cared for by one. So I think that was kind of an interesting aside. But again, throughout art history, you'll see these images of the plague saints and what they were used for, what the images were used for. I have three names up here, Jacques Caillot, Francisco Goya, and Otto Dich. And the reason why I have these names up here is these are three printmakers very important to the printmaking tradition, but also in talking about the plague and pandemic, it's such a horrific human experience. And these three printmakers have the honor, I guess, of being probably the three best illustrators of human horror in the printmaking tradition. All three of them are very famous for doing series of prints called having to do with war in, well, we'll go through and talk about them. I just want to know specifically, I think Jacques Caillot was the miseries of war. Okay, so Caillot was the miseries of war, Goya, the disasters of war, and Otto Dich just made a series called War. And when I was thinking about images of pandemic and how horrific it was, my mind immediately went to these three printmakers, and they didn't really disappoint. I am going to say that the images of these three artists regarding war and suffering are so graphic and so horrific. I'm really going to show ones that are related to disease, illness, and suffering. If you want to look at these, I think you might be quite shocked how graphic they are. All three of these people were eyewitnesses to war in their time. Again, this kind of speaks to the democratization of images that printmakers do, the kind of reportage. We think in our time, like a relatively modern time, we think of war photography starting with Matthew Brady, and some of the more modern wars. But before photography, especially in the case of Cayo and Goya, the only means of representing what had happened, of communicating horrors that occurred to humanity, was that people had to observe them, and someone just had to be willing to draw them and to make images of them and print them. So these are all in the right, extremely good printmakers, and kind of significant subject matter, kind of the three printmakers of disaster. So I just want to put their names up. Here's another Saint Sebastian image, and this is by Jacques Caillot. It's an etching. Let me describe. Engraving is intaglio, etching is as well. The difference between the two is in engraving, you have sharp tools and you're literally carving into metal. Etching was kind of a Renaissance printmaking innovation, and what it allowed printmakers to do is coat a piece of steel with wax and then draw into it with a very sharp point like a needle, put the plate in acid. The acid does the work. So basically, again, it's more like the ease of drawing, acid doing the work, making the lines in the plate. And then again, you ink up the plate, you wipe it clean, and then you press your images. And everything that you see is a line that you have drawn in the wax that's been cut away. I want to say a few things about the innovations and style of Caillot, because he really was an innovator. You see here, there's an atmospheric perspective of things in the foreground, very sharp, and then they fade some more. Caillot was the first printmaker to really use this technique a lot. And what he's doing, if you recall, I mentioned putting the plate in acid. You can draw your image, you can put it in the acid for a little while, it will bite the plate, and then you can take it out, and things that are far away or that you want very light, you can recoat those selectively. You put your plate back in the acid bath, let it sit for a while longer. You can pull it out again. So he has, you can see at least 3 times he pulled a plate out. We call it stopping out. He stopped out some of his imagery. He pulled it, he put it in, he pulled it out. He stopped out a little more, this broken Colosseum, you see it kind of alluding to the decay of the Roman society that was executing all these saints. And then the foreground, you see again, the archers are there, people watching. In the center, you have the focal point of Sebastian tied to the pole, being shot through with arrows. Part of Caillot's style, and his work is very small. This is just a matter of inches. It could be like 3 by 4. Some of his work is as small as 2 by 3 inches. But to me, it's almost like they're like the Where's Waldo of printmaking, is that there's so much to look at, and sometimes you really have to look and look to find what he wants you to see. In some of his etchings, especially the war etchings and the punishments etchings, it's in a way you almost don't want to see what he wants you to see. It's so horrific, but he really makes you look. Always these heavily peopled scenes, people everywhere, people doing things that aren't even related to what's going on. The ruins, plant life, You could just look for a long time at different scenes in this image, and it would have nothing to do with the fact that someone was being tortured to death. There's in the background, you can see there's someone who has a kind of scary job of having to go pick up stray arrows. All these little human details he put into his etchings. And so this is a real, a good example of his work. And also, again, you see how this, the imagery of Saint Sebastian was so popular during this time period. It's, this image is made for a procession in Caillox's hometown of Nancy, France, or Lorraine. And even at that time, people would have these images. They'd take them on parades to show people, to get people to respect and venerate these saints who might be able to save them from plague. You'll see here, it says from the Miseries of War small set. The small set was like 2 by 3.5 inches, extremely small. He made another series of larger Miseries of War. They're just only bigger by inches. But what this depicts, maybe not so much the plague or a pandemic, but there is a lot of illness and suffering. Over here at the right corner, there are people who are obviously ill. People are catering to their needs. When you look closely at this, you see these are soldiers. This is near the end of the series, and this is probably the mildest image from this Miseries of War series. But these are the soldiers after the war. The war in question here was the 30 Years' War, when France invaded Lorraine, which was then more kind of a German area. So we're looking at scenes that are coming from the 30 Years' War in that part of northeastern France. Legless veterans scooting around with pads or on their knees, begging. Supposedly these are soldiers, and so they're supposed to be honored and taken care of and feted, and yet here they are, damaged and injured and reduced to begging on the streets and dying of illness, of starvation. So again, maybe not literally about a plague per se, but certainly a rendition of human suffering and illness, and what happens when these large scale disasters befall humankind. I'm going to move forward a century or so here now and talk about some prints that came out of the London plague. There was a very bad plague. The bubonic plague hit London in 1665. You may know of the English novelist Daniel Defoe wrote a journal of the plague year. At that, he wrote it a little later, but he described that whole terrible year. By this time, printmaking was well established throughout Europe. We have here, this is an engraving. So again, carving into metal by John Dunstall. And it's just a variety of the plague scenes of London, funeral processions, mass graves. I think this is something we can relate to with COVID-19. I think especially last spring when things are so bad, when they're so bad in some of our cities, you can easily go to the internet and see some of these same horrific scenes of funerals, of even mass graves, people dying in hospitals and infirmaries. This center small illustration here is the people who would come around with carts collecting dead bodies. You might recall the scene, I think it's on Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where they clang a bell and say, "Bring out your dead." And it seems like a joke, but that's really what they used to do. That's what they did during this plague year of London. So here you have the collection of bodies and everything related to just the terrible disease and death that's happening in the city of London at that time. The engraving I just showed you was kind of contemporary of the plague year. This was an illustration done later in the 1747, and this is also an engraving, but again, it's that scenery. Obviously, this event made an impression. They were still illustrating it into the next century. Here you see just the collection of bodies, the general depressing scenery, the people mourning in the distance. And then these are more contemporary with the actual plague. These are more an example of the Bildwissenschaft images that aren't necessarily art, but that have to do with an event, that give us an idea of what people were thinking and illustrating and publishing. Again, more of an amateurish wood carving, but the skulls and the shovels. Again, I'm sorry. The hourglass reminding people that their time will run out. And these were published sometimes daily in London when this was happening. They would print lists of the dead so you would know who had died. They would print them by neighborhoods so you know where to avoid going. Again, there's on the Lord have mercy on us broadside, you see again an illustration, some of those scenes of plague. And these also might contain prayers, recipes for sickness. I think there was one of boiling garlic in milk and drinking it might help you avoid the plague. So again, these are examples of printmaking during this time. It allows you to see different levels of technique and artistry, but always the printmaking and that idea that information can be reproduced and disseminated to people's benefit. I included this engraving just as a reminder that one of the great pandemics in human history, and this is an illustration of that, is the smallpox and other diseases that were brought to the New World by European settlers. This is an illustration of a smallpox pandemic among indigenous peoples. I don't even know the artist for this. It's just maybe again an example of Bildwissen, of people illustrating events for people to know about and look at and think about, not necessarily to get artistic credit, but just because they want to share some information. There aren't a lot of images like this. Again, I think it was something that people wanted to avoid taking responsibility for or thinking about, but it was definitely a pandemic event that this one artist in particular felt compelled to share.
Hey, Deb.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention it's 12:52, and I know you have class at 1, so I didn't know if you wanted to take questions or share a couple more.
I can. I didn't realize I would take so much time. I'm just wondering if there are, what I'd like to do is go quickly through some modern examples.
Okay.
Can I do that?
Yeah, of course.
I was going to quickly talk about Goya and his scenes of illness during the Napoleonic Wars. Let's skip these. I also wanted to talk about Edvard Munch, a famous Norwegian artist, a very innovative printmaker. We don't always realize that he was, who did portraits of himself while he was sick with the Spanish flu and after he recovered. And the artist and printmaker Egon Schiele, who you can see by the dates, did not live long, a portrait of himself and his wife and the child they were hoping to have until she died of the Spanish influenza. This is her maybe a day before she died. So it's a really immediate expression of art in the face of that world pandemic. And I did also want to mention about the AIDS, HIV epidemic and how printmakers addressed that with silkscreen posters that then they wheat pasted around the city, trying to remind people that, again, this was an epidemic a lot of people would rather just ignore, brush under the carpet, but it was very widespread, and printmaking was used to get it into people's face that, hey, we've got a problem, people are dying, and this was very effective. Eventually, finances were put into the research, and medical resources for the AIDS epidemic. So the very last things I want to show are some contemporary artists and their pandemic art. University of COVID, comic type art. These are all from the Plague Review, which is published relatively nearby. It's published by the Rotland Press in Detroit, Michigan. And the mission of their press is to highlight the work of a lot of contemporary printmakers who are kind of looking at the underside, the underworld of society, as it were. And COVID-19 gave them a lot of material, obviously, that they published several reviews just of plague art and writings. I guess we do not have time for this image. Again, more screen printing. I want to show these last two images because they are so immediate. These are done by Kelly Vanderclay, and she is a member of Southwest Michigan Printmakers and a graphic design instructor for Van Buren County. And she recently did some plastic plate lithographs regarding the COVID pandemic and her response to it. A closed restaurant, a closed school, which she's very close to because she works for the public schools. And again, so just wrapping up to show you that throughout history, we've had printmakers always using their medium to address this, sometimes very dark, because it is a dark subject, showing their personal experiences of even their own loved ones dying, of themselves being very sick. And just kind of a continuation, a reminder that because printmaking is about sharing information, it always has a lot to say. So I'm going to end there, and if there are questions, I will take them. Sure.
Great. You are on mute, everyone. So if you do have a question, you will need to unmute yourselves first. Oh, I see. Let's see. In the chat, Emily, love the labor camp work. Have been following on Instagram. Kay Brewer said, fantastic. What was the bird image?
It said Pestvogel, Pestvers, and those are, it's a contemporary artist named Walton Ford, and his issue is very much about environmental destruction. But the Bohemian waxwings are called plague birds because throughout history, flocks of them appear. Supposedly, whenever there's a plague, there's big flocks of them even before World War I. And so in his image, what he wanted to show were these birds. They're just gorging on berries, the vines turning into barbed wire. For him, it's about environmental destruction. Again, it's like all these human horrors that so often are hand in hand. One thing leads to another. And because, I thought it was interesting how I'd never heard about these pest birds, these pestvogels that appeared in flocks in Europe. But that's the nature of that illustration. And you see, he dates it 1917, but this is a 1919, a 2019 print. And it's a 6-plate color intaglio. So you can kind of appreciate how all that color blends together.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Christina said, thank you, great information, lots to take in.
Yeah, it was. I didn't realize it would expand the way it did, but I really appreciate people listening, and I hope you've learned something from it.
Yeah, I know. I definitely did.
Great.
Does anyone have a final question before we say goodbye for the day? Emily said, incredibly interesting, Deb. I'd be interested in a part 2 to really dig into the rest. And I would too. Of course, KIA operates on a Sightlines schedule, so it wouldn't be until at least May or June.
It'd be nice if we were farther away from it then. I don't know. But.
Yeah.
just so people know the information's out there. The artistic experiences are out there to be seen. So.
And then Sue said, thank you so much. Lots of inspiration for COVID art.
Mm-hmm.
Have you made any
Great.
prints related to our current pandemic?
No, I haven't. I think when it just started, I experimented with some monoprint drawing, and then that was it. I guess my energy is going into how can we keep teaching and sharing work when we can't be meeting up together. So a lot of things like online instruction, things like that. More the practicalities rather than the subject matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you are spending a lot of energy on that. If anyone with us isn't aware, like we mentioned, Deb is with the Kirk Newman Art School, and she does do classes both in person and online. So if you're not taking a class, but you are interested and you don't want to leave your home, which we totally understand, you can join us online for a Zoom class.
Yes, and I would like to say that when things get back to normal, every printmaking method that I've talked about today, and some I didn't get a chance to, we teach them all at the KIA. I mean, I didn't even touch on lithography and things like that, but except for Kelly's at the end. But these things may seem remote, but they're not. They're very much with us today, and they are in the basement of your own KIA. So you can check it out.
And they're fabulous. I took beginning printmaking with Deb last semester, and I had such a good time and can't wait to come back as well. And Emily, my pleasure. Okay, well, it's 1 p.m., so ArtBreak is officially over, and we enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your knowledge, Deb.
Sure.
And I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. And I hope to see you, some of you, the next event is next Thursday night, February with Dr. Deborah Willis. I hope you can come into the KIA if you're feeling comfortable. And yeah, great. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye. Oh, and Jim Carter says, well done.